This is knowledge engineering with semantic web technologies. And this is the second part of the first lecture, knowledge engineering and the web of data. While in the previous part of the lecture, we were talking about the information in the web. And to understand the information in the web, it is really important to determine the correct meaning. So, in this part of the lecture, we will talk about the importance of meaning and what meaning really is. So first of all, meaning and comprehension, meaning and understanding are closely coupled. So understanding is nothing else but the ability to grasp the meaning of information. And usually this information is conveyed in a message between sender and receiver, and this message is formulated or written in a specific language. Okay, so we have a message which is passed from a sender to a receiver. And to understand the content of this message, the receiver must be able to interpret the content correctly. So the receiver reads the content and he has to understand the meaning, which means he has to interpret all the signs, the characters of the message in a correct way. If the interpretation is wrong, the receiver does not understand the message. So this is the basic concept here. Understanding means correct interpretation of information content. Okay, and usually now this correct interpretation is dependent on the so-called syntax as the most basic building block of information of languages, then on the semantics, which defines how these symbols created in the syntax will be interpreted, and of course the context and the pragmatics, which determine the semantics. And on the other hand, also on the so-called experience of sender and receiver, because the experience, the world knowledge, what you know about the world, determines also the way how a message is interpreted or how you formulate your message, because you intend to adapt the information content as a sender to the world knowledge and the experience and the knowledge of the receiver. So these terms, these concepts are closely coupled and are important to grasp the meaning of understanding. So first, let's have a look at the syntax. So syntax is a word which stems from the Greek, so it means something like arrangement or ordering. So usually in grammatic, syntax denotes the study of principles and processes by which sentences are constructed in a particular language. So computer science uses it the same way, formulates it a little bit different. So in computer science, we have, for example, formal languages, not natural languages like in grammatics, but formal languages. And in formal languages, the syntax is nothing but a set of rules by which so-called well-formed expressions can be created from a fundamental set of symbols, which is the alphabet. So you have a fundamental set of symbols, an alphabet, which can be characters, which can be words. And you have a set of rules which determine how these symbols of your alphabet have been put together to form something meaningful, which means to form something which is allowed according to the rules of syntax. So in computer science, in general, syntax defines the so-called normative structure of the data that you are using. And there are rules which say what is allowed and what is not allowed. So syntax is the basic building block. It only tells you what kind of messages, what arrangement of characters are allowed and which not to form a so-called well-formed expression. But on the other hand, syntax does not tell you anything about the meaning of the things you are doing here. So for that, to convey meaning within information, you need semantics. Semantics is also a term which comes from Greek, and it means it pertains to the character, or it is the study of meaning. Semantics itself is part of linguistics, and it's focused on sense and meaning of language or symbols of the language. So here is really the fundamental concept that is important to understand, to interpret things correctly. So semantics is the study of interpretation of signs or symbols as used by agents or communities within particular circumstances and contexts. So context, as we see here, is important to disambiguate or to define the right semantics. the right way to interpret your message. To do this, semantics asks how sense and meaning of so-called complex concepts can be derived from simple and basic concepts. And the nice thing is, semantics tries to do that with the rules of syntax. So there are syntactic rules which enable you to derive the meaning of complex concepts from the meaning of more basic concepts. So this is the way how semantics works. And you see here semantics acts and works with syntax. So it uses the rules of syntax to derive the meaning of more complex things. So in the end, semantics as we see it here, the semantics of a message, to interpret a message correctly, this depends on the context of the information. So the information alone can be interpreted in different ways. And the way how or which semantics we choose defines this, or is dependent on the so-called context. On the one hand side, so additional information. Context can be, for example, your location and the point in time when I formulate the message. So it's clear that if I formulate a message to you, if I interpret it now, it means possibly something different than in the case when it's interpreted 100 years before that time or 100 years after that time. So usually context defines a time frame in which a specific semantics is valid. And on the other hand, you also have the pragmatics, which is something which defines the intention of the sender of a message. So usually the sender wants to provoke a certain reaction on his information, on the information he conveys to the receiver. So he has a specific intention, and this intention is usually within the so-called pragmatics, or is the pragmatics of the sender. Okay, so we now have syntax, the most common basic building block, how sentences, well-formed sentences within a language are formulated, and we have semantics with a set of rules that also stem from syntactics or from syntax. And these rules tell you how you convey meaning and sense of complex concepts based on the sense of more simple concepts. So you try to break down this problem on a simpler problem. Okay, context. We have just talked about context. Comes from Latin this time, so contextus means interweaved. And this, of course, denotes the surrounding of a symbol, of a concept in an expression, respective its relationship with surrounding expressions or other concepts and further related elements. So the context denotes all elements of any sort of communication that define the interpretation of the communicated content. So, for example, the place, the time, and other information that is also available together with a message that stems from the receiver and is passed, that stems from the sender and is passed to the receiver. All additional information defines the context, and the context itself defines which kind of semantics will be chosen. So usually we distinguish between the so-called general context, which is place, time, and interrelation of action in a message, and the so-called personal context. So because sender and receiver, of course, they have a rather personal context, and of course the relation between sender and receiver and the relation between, for example, persons or things which are mentioned within the message that is passed and the sender and the receiver, they are also important and determine how the message then in the end will be interpreted. So we have general contexts which are more abstract, more general, and are not dependent on your personal context or your social context. So these two things can be distinguished here for the context, and they are important for the determination of the right semantics. Besides the context, we also have pragmatics, also from Greek, it means action, and pragmatics reflects the intention by which the language is used to communicate a message. So it really reflects the intention of the sender. So in linguistic, pragmatics denotes the study of applying language in different situations. So it means different situations have different context, and also, of course, the sender and receiver have different pragmatics. So it denotes the intended purpose of the speaker, of the sender of the message. And it studies the ways in which context contributes to meaning. So this is pragmatics. So we have syntax as the most basic building block. We have semantics as the interpretation. How do I get the meaning from all these characters which have been sent from the information? And we have context and pragmatics, which in the end determine which kind of semantics is applied to understand or to interpret the message correctly. And in the end, of course, also additional information which is not explicit, but which is accumulated within the sender and in the receiver has to be regarded, which is the so-called experience or world knowledge. So the experience considers all information that you have learned and put in context with the world you are living in. Experience in this sense also often is referred to as common sense or world knowledge. And of course, it does influence how you interpret information. Of course, how you interpret the meaning of a message depends on what experience, what knowledge you have that you can apply to create a context, to interpret the pragmatics of the sender, and in the end to understand or interpret the meaning of the conveyed message correctly. So now we have the building blocks for a successful communication, and for successful communication, of course, the information has to be correctly transmitted on the first hand. So the most basic building block, syntax, takes care that information has to be correctly transmitted. And then, of course, the meaning, the semantics of the transmitted information must be interpreted correctly. This is the process of understanding, which is, of course, necessary for successful communication. But the understanding, so the correct interpretation, depends first on the context of both, of sender and receiver, and also of the pragmatics of the sender. And again, then the context of both depends on the experience, the world knowledge of both, of sender and receiver. And only then, if all of these factors are considered and interpreted correctly, successful communication is possible. So you see, it is really important to understand or to interpret the meaning of a message in a correct way. And there are lots of factors which influence the correct interpretation. So this is also one of the reasons why understanding of natural language is so complicated, because natural language is highly ambiguous and it always takes into account all possible contexts. So this is a major difference to artificial languages, like for example in computer science, which only have one unique meaning and which are easy or simple to interpret. So formal languages, much easier than natural languages, simply because of the lack of ambiguity. Okay, so let's have an example. So maybe you have seen this already in your literature or language classes. This is the so-called semiotic triangle. So usually you start with the interpretation of a so-called symbol. So you have a symbol like here, the jaguar. It's in the corner on the left side. And usually this symbol stands for an object in the real world or also for an abstract object. So jaguar might stand here because of its ambiguity for several things, for the cars, for the cat, or maybe also for the operating system. So usually if you are using a symbol like that, it symbolizes a concept. And to enable successful communication, of course, you must share the same concept between sender and receiver. And of course, to determine the right concept depends, as you see here, on context, on pragmatics, as well as on experience. Only then the message can be conveyed correctly and interpreted correctly between sender and receiver. So these are the building blocks of basic understanding. Okay. And based on that, the problem is that in the traditional web, there is also no explicit semantics because most of the information that is transferred in the web is encoded either within language or it's encoded, for example, within multimedia data. So, for example, as images, photographies, or videos or audio files. So it means somehow the meaning is hidden. The semantics is not made explicit. It's there, but it has to be interpreted, and the interpretation, of course, has to be determined from all the contextual data that is available. And this makes it really difficult in the traditional web to understand the correct meaning of the information. So, in the next part of the lecture, we will deal with how this understanding of the information content might work on the web.